She said my name softly, Evan, like a dare and an invitation at once. And the sound of it pulled me across the kitchen table the way tide pulls at a rotted dock. Piling, steady, relentless, and then my mouth was on hers while Florida rain shouldered the windows and the overhead light hummed and the coffee I'd brewed went cold between us. And in that small reckless span I crossed the line I had lectured other men about for decades. The line I told myself I would guard even after burying Eileen. The line I'd pinned to sermons and fatherly advice and the brittle pride of a man who believed routine could anchor him against loneliness, yet there I was, 65. A ring still indenting the skin of my finger out of habit if not obligation. Kissing a 42-year-old woman whose hair smelled faintly of rain and rosemary and whose name, Maribel, had become a regular note in the music of my days. First as the assistant my daughter Lila hired to sort out the mess of estate paperwork I refused to face, then as the person who learned where I kept the good mugs. Who noticed when the AC coughed? Who told me the exact aisle at Publix where they hide the proper starch for pressing shirts? Who stayed when she didn't have to and laughed at my stale jokes and didn't mind when I forgot what I was saying halfway through and had to trace my path backward with my fingers on the table like a man mapping old trails on a paper he won't admit he lost? And I wish I could claim the storm bewitched me, that thunder made me stupid. But it was quieter than that, a long accumulation of glances and silences and an evening that stretched past bookkeeping into confessions we had no business sharing. The lightning only outlining what had already changed. She asked if the house felt bigger now that Eileen had been gone 7 years and I said no. Though every room in that ranch had grown cavernous around me. And when her hand brushed mine there wasn't shock so much as recognition. Like a tune you haven't heard in decades and yet can whistle straight through. And I said, just once before her mouth found mine and the words turned into breath and sound. And then it was done and the distance I had used to keep myself righteous fell away like scaffolding. We pulled apart, both of us aware of the clock ticking and the rain easing and the way the light had shifted on the counter. Aware of the small normalities that still insisted on existing while something larger tilted beneath them, and I told her she should go. Stupid words given how badly my hands wanted her to stay, but she stood anyway. Denim jacket damp at the shoulders. Glance catching on the framed photo of Eileen and me in Montauk. 26 and sunburned and trying not to squint. And then she was gone and the front door shut and the hum of the fridge felt like judgment. And for 3 days I pretended nothing had changed. I ate boiled eggs. I watered the snake plant by the back slider. I let Lila talk through her toddler's ear infection on speaker while I nodded at air. I even went to the men's breakfast at Calvary and smiled at men who use words like guardrails and covenant and accountability as if they were notches we could carve in wood to keep ourselves from slipping, but desire at my age didn't get loud, it got patient. It appeared in the quiet moments like steam on a mirror. And when Maribel texted a photo of the stray tortoiseshell who sleeps on my porch rail with the caption, "She misses you," the ache came back sharp enough that I closed the blinds and paced the kitchen counting off the floor tiles like a man measuring a cell. And I told myself to stop but I didn't, and the next time she came by, sunny sky. No storm to blame, just a Tuesday that wouldn't end. I opened the door before she finished knocking and we moved through the house like people who already knew the map. Her palm on the old scar under my ribs from a dumb ladder accident in '92. My fingers at the small of her back as if I had earned any right to her at all. And afterward I watched the ceiling fan spin slow circles and the dust in the beams of late afternoon, and a piece of me howled quietly somewhere I couldn't reach while another part lay in warm relief, and that was the beginning of the weeks when time lost its shape. She'd come over with a manila folder and we'd end up eating leftover key lime pie straight from the foil with 2 forks. She'd bring me Cuban sandwiches from the shop on Orange and I'd slice them in half like sacrament. She'd leave a book on the nightstand, Elizabeth Bishop poems, penciled lines, and I'd pretend it was a loan and not a mark, a claim. And one night she asked if I ever went to the beach anymore, and I lied again because the beach had been Eileen and the sound of waves still felt like a language I didn't dare speak without her. But the next morning we drove to New Smyrna anyway and stood watching brown pelicans cut clean lines over the glittering chop, and she slipped her hand into my pocket like a teenager. And I felt a living foolishness I'd not permitted myself in decades. A gladness that was almost grief in reverse. This is where I tell you I remembered Lila's voice from last winter, the way she'd said, "Dad, don't let anyone take advantage," and I'd waved her off, insulted. As if the thought of need in me was an affront. But secrecy has a way of souring even sweetness, and the small mistakes piled up. Maribel's scarf with cinnamon-colored threads left on a dining chair. A second toothbrush tucked behind the aloe lotion. The receipt for a motel by I-95 I had paid cash for but stupidly folded into my wallet, alongside the punch card from the car wash. And then came the day Lila used her key because she'd brought matzo ball soup for what she called my permanent sniffles. And she stood in the doorway of the bedroom holding a grocery bag and taking in the second pillow, the wrong book on the nightstand, the smell of a shampoo that wasn't mine. And her face did a thing I can't forget, like a curtain caught and torn on a nail. And she said my name too quietly, not the dare way, the wounded way, and I lied poorly. Said a neighbor had stopped by, which is not an answer to what she did not ask. And she shook her head slowly and backed out, and the soup sat on the counter untouched and cold all afternoon while I practiced confessions into my hands and failed to say them. The next morning there was an envelope at my door, no return address. Inside 3 photographs of me and Maribel in the dull parking lot of the Seabreeze Inn, grainy, harsh, undeniable, and for a long minute I couldn't figure out who they were for. Because surely the person who mailed them hated me, but the note was addressed to Mr. Pierce, my last name printed neatly in a hand I didn't recognize, and the line below said, "He deserves to know what kind of man you are." And that is how I learned the photographs were meant for someone else, not Lila. Not the men at church, but a husband. And I looked at Maribel the way you do at a magic trick you realize too late is knives and hinges. Not wonder. I confronted her clumsily that night, and she sat at the edge of my bed with her hands clenched and told me about Arturo, a husband more placeholder than partner. A man who never moved out, who slept in the extra room, who lived a life of loud silences and side hustles and controlled everything with charm and threat. A man who had, it turned out, placed a tracker in her car when the electric bill went overdue and had hired a cousin to follow her for a week, a cousin who took the photos at the motel. A cousin who now had the envelope meant for Arturo but decided I should first see what was coming, and in that moment my sin didn't shrink because of her explanations, it multiplied. My pity tangling with my guilt until I could hardly breathe. I told her we had to stop to get ahead of it, and she laughed without humor and said there was no ahead. There was only a mess, and for the first time I heard anger in her voice sharp enough to cut Not at me but at the corner she lived in. At the way Florida humidity can make every room feel sticky with what you can't escape. 2 days later, during Thursday choir practice at Calvary, my phone buzzed and kept buzzing until I stepped into the breezeway and answered, and Lila's voice shook as she said she'd met a man at the house who'd handed her copies of those photographs, that he'd been polite and tight, smiled, and told her he wanted to be sure I wasn't being scammed by a woman who used widowers, and my daughter said, "Dad, tell me it isn't true." And what I said, because there was nothing left to hide behind, was, "I crossed a line." And she hung up and I sang nothing that night and left early, embarrassed by how the sanctuary lights always seem to make old men look more fragile. And when I got home, Arturo himself was in my driveway leaning on the hood of a white Corolla, dressed neat as a Sunday usher, and he smiled a smile that never touched his eyes and said, "Senor Pierce, we should talk like men." And in the kitchen he set terms like we were dividing counties. Like my body and hers were parcels to deed. He didn't want money, he said. He wanted me to step away and to know he knew where I kept my spare key under a blue stone frog. And that I should be careful driving at night because sidewalks are narrow and mistakes happen. And I stared at my hands because I'd always believed violence belonged to other people's stories, and after he left I locked every door and window and then unlocked them again because the house felt like a mouth biting down on me. I called Maribel twice and she didn't pick up. And when she finally came by at noon the next day, her face was blotched and her left wrist bore a fingerprint bruise, and I moved toward her and she stepped back and told me not to make anything worse, that she had a plan to get out and that plan did not include me because I was collateral now, and she said something that kept me up for nights: "You made me feel seen. And that makes you dangerous," and I knew exactly what she meant because visibility changes a person and it makes all the dark corners you've arranged for yourself unbearable. And I told her I'd go to the police and she shook her head with that small tired smile of women who already know what papers won't fix and said, "Save your faith for something you can carry." And then she kissed my cheek once, a benediction or a goodbye, and vanished into the glare of noon. In the week that followed, the photographs did their final work, an anonymous packet mailed to the church office. 2 whispers at the diner, a conversation I intercepted in the Walgreens vitamin aisle between 2 women who recognized me from the Rotary pancake breakfast and glanced away too late. And I wanted to shout at them that I was not a headline or a moral. I was a man who had slept alone long enough to forget the warmth that makes a person willing to stay alive, but I said nothing, because shame taught me quiet. Lila stopped bringing my grandson over for a while, and when we finally sat across from each other at the picnic table in Riverside Park, the first tried to blame grief the way a drunk blames ice for his stumbling, and she said, "You can't keep Mom as a shield." And then she told me a second thing I didn't see coming, a twist that rearranged the room. She had known Maribel before I did, not through the estate lawyer, but at a grief group she tried once and never went back to, where Maribel had talked about living with a living loss and Lila had talked about living with a dead one, and they had swapped numbers they never used. And months later, when Lila told our lawyer to hire help, she had seen Maribel's name on a list and felt, her word, relief, because it meant someone kind might be around me when she couldn't. And the look she gave me then, tenderness wrapped around disbelief, will not leave me. Because it said, "I tried to protect you and you turned solace into secrecy." Yet in the same breath she reached out and pressed her fingers against the back of my hand for the briefest moment, and I felt hope like a stubborn weed pushing up through a crack in a parking lot, and I told her the whole story. Not because confession absolves, but because it's the only thing you can carry out of a burning house, and that night the house didn't feel so tight even though I slept badly. Months have shuffled forward since, in a slower key, no more midnight texts. No spare toothbrush behind the aloe. My ring now sitting in a ceramic dish shaped like a scallop shell that we bought in Tarpon Springs back in '88, the groove it left on my skin softening. Lila calling more again, but sometimes letting the phone ring out as if discipline had become its own language between us. Calvary moving me off the accountability committee without naming me from the pulpit, which was mercy or cowardice or both, and Florida kept on being Florida. Summer thunderheads blooming huge and theatrical over the causeway. The elderly walking their dogs at dawn with plastic bags fisted like balloons. The sea breeze in repainted a bland cheerful blue as if color itself can erase. Occasionally I see a woman in a denim jacket and my chest knocks itself around before I realize it isn't her, and once, months later, at a red light by the farmer's market, a white Corolla pulled up next to me with its window down and salsa brash in the sun, and the driver glanced over, not Arturo, just a man in sunglasses adjusting his visor. And I laughed alone in my car in a sound that wasn't entirely sane, and then I cried and felt grateful for the afternoon glare that makes tears look like sweat. If you're waiting for punishment to arrive as lightning, it almost never does. It arrives in 100 small edits to your life, friends who pause before inviting you to things, a neighbor who nods but does not stop, your own hand choosing the back pew by habit, the ceiling fan above your bed becoming a metronome of time you cannot reclaim. And yet in that slower life there is also a stubborn goodness that refuses to vanish. Like the way the porch stray still curls on the rail and blinks at me as if my failures bore no scent she can detect, like the way a pelican will still knife the water perfectly whether or not I am a decent man. Last week I drove to the ocean alone because on the back of an old Bishop paperback I found a penciled line of Maribel's "The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master," and I realized she had been leaving me instructions disguised as poems. And I parked near Ponce Inlet and walked until my hips protested and the shorebirds made delicate translations of the foam, and a kid 20 yards down tossed a frisbee to a mother who ran with an awkward joy I recognized. And I took the ring out of my pocket and turned it over in my palm and didn't throw it in. Didn't put it back on, I simply held it until my hand hurt from gripping. And that is the best I can describe the thing I live with now. Holding both the weight and the shape of what I swore and what I broke without pretending one undoes the other. When I got home, there was a postcard in my mailbox, no return address. A picture of St. Augustine's lighthouse on the front and on the back. In a hand I knew by the way it loops its G's like rope, a single sentence. I am safe and he is gone, nothing else. And I stood on my porch while the sky bruised into orange, and I realized that sometimes mercy arrives without a face to thank, and I said out loud to no one, "Good." And the stray stretched and yawned and blinked again, and somewhere a neighbor's wind chimes started angelic nonsense, and I went inside and made a pot of coffee at 6 p.m. like a man who no longer knows rules. And I set the ring back in the dish and straightened the Bishop paperback on the shelf and folded the postcard into the back of it where other instructions live. This is as close as I can come to an ending, no true ending. Only the ongoing work of living with the canyon I opened. Building a narrow footbridge across each morning with whatever I have, a spoon against a sink. A phone call I answer instead of dodge. A beach where the line between wet and dry sand moves under the pressure of each wave. Not erased, never erased, only redrawn by forces larger than me. And some days I stand with my toes at that shifting edge and I say her name to the wind, not to summon her but to admit she happened, that I chose what I chose. That I was not a man built of pure principle but of hunger and fear and tenderness and stubbornness and the ridiculous hope that after you break yourself you can still be of use to the people you love, and sometimes that admission is the only honest prayer I can manage. A small unpretty sound beneath the ceiling fan's slow pulse. The kind that doesn't change God's mind about anything but might, if I am lucky, keep my own from going quiet.